After a heavy snowfall in South Devon, England, on the night of February 8, 1855, families woke to hoof-like marks outside their homes. The reports began around the Exe estuary and nearby villages, including areas around Exmouth and Topsham. The tracks looked too regular for random damage, yet they matched no animal anyone could confidently name. The marks crossed paths, yards, gardens, and nearby ground in the February cold. They appeared as paired impressions or small hoof-shaped prints, often described as roughly 4 inches long. At first, residents could have mistaken them for ordinary animal tracks. But the longer people studied their spacing and direction, the less ordinary they seemed. The story does not begin with anyone seeing a devil. It begins with reports of footprints in the snow, recorded after the snowfall and repeated through local correspondence and newspaper accounts. That difference matters, because the marks are the first evidence, while the creature came later as an idea attached to unexplained evidence. People described a long line of small prints, placed one after another across the frozen ground. Some accounts emphasized their regular spacing and the absence of obvious paw marks, claws, or toes. No trusted witness recorded a clear sighting of the thing that made them, and no body, animal, or person was identified at the end of the trail. The shock came from finding something strange in places that should have felt safe. A yard, a path, or the space beside a door was familiar ground, known by every family who lived there. In a rural community, residents recognized ordinary livestock tracks, boot prints, and wagon marks, so unfamiliar impressions near houses carried an immediate practical threat. Snow usually tells a clear story. It shows where a person walked, where an animal ran, or where a cart passed. It can preserve direction, weight, and sequence. These marks seem to tell a story with the middle missing because the reported line continued across obstacles without revealing a clear approach, departure, or ordinary change in gait. Reports soon gave the trail a remarkable size. The footprints were said to stretch across more than 100 miles of Devon, linking scattered locations rather than remaining inside one village. That figure came from collected reports, not from a modern survey of one continuous measured track. And the distinction is essential when separating historical testimony from physical proof. Distance changed the problem. A prank might explain marks in one yard, especially if a person had used an object to stamp the snow. But a trail reported across many towns suggested either many separate events or one event people believed was connected. The farther the story traveled, the more local observations became part of a single regional mystery. As fear spread, local residents reached for the strongest name they had. When the marks seemed to pass over roofs, across high fences, or through walls, the devil's footprints became a way to name the terror. The label was reinforced by older British folklore, in which the devil could cross impossible spaces and leave physical signs of his presence. The name gave the mystery a shape, but it did not explain the trail. It could not show how anything had crossed a barrier, why the marks looked alike, or whether every report belonged to the same event. Even the phrase "devil's footprints" was an interpretation applied after the observations, not a measurement taken from the snow itself. One legend hides 3 different questions. Did the marks really exist? Did they form one unbroken trail? And what could have made their strange shape? Those questions require different kinds of evidence: contemporary documents for the reports, mapped locations for the supposed route, and experiments or natural comparisons for the physical impressions. Historical evidence may support the first question more strongly than the other 2. Written reports can show that people saw unusual marks, and newspapers can show that the story circulated in February and March 1855. But those sources cannot always prove that every mark came from one source, because many observations were recorded secondhand and locations were not consistently surveyed. Then came the detail that made the story feel impossible. The reported trail seemed to appear on rooftops, cross high fences, and continue through places where no clear path could be found. Some accounts described marks on opposite sides of barriers, while others only repeated that the tracks had crossed them. The surviving record does not provide a complete, independently checked route. That detail carried a deeper fear. People were not only asking what had walked through the village, they were asking whether any wall, door, or fence could protect a family from it. A boundary that normally separated a private yard from the road became part of the evidence, because every unexplained crossing made the tracks seem less like animal movement and more like deliberate intrusion. But what did the witnesses truly possess? They had marks in the snow, stories passed from one home to another, and the terror created by steps that seemed to vanish. They did not have photographs, plaster casts, laboratory samples, or a preserved trail. The evidence was temporary from the beginning because sunlight, thawing, wind, and human traffic quickly altered the snow. A footprint proves that pressure touched the ground. By itself, it does not reveal the body that made the mark, the path that body took, or the mind people later placed behind it. A shape can be distorted by melting, drifting snow, poor light, or repeated retelling. To identify a maker, investigators would need consistent dimensions, depth, spacing, and a reliable sequence of impressions. The event took place in the Victorian era, a time when many people were beginning to trust measurement, records, and science more than old tales. The year 1855 also belonged to a rapidly expanding newspaper culture, allowing local reports to travel far beyond Devon. Yet religious fear still shaped daily life, especially in isolated places where winter darkness, limited communication, and unfamiliar natural events could magnify uncertainty. The people of Devon stood between those two forces. They wanted a natural answer, but the devil was the easiest answer to remember when the snow appeared to break the rules. The historical task is more demanding: preserve what was actually reported, identify where accounts were repeated or embellished, and distinguish the documented footprints from the supernatural explanation attached to them. Heavy snow could cut one home off from the next, turning nearby neighbors into distant ones. On the morning of 9th February, 1855, a person who found strange marks outside the door might have had no easy way to check them at once. Roads were difficult, daylight was limited, and fear could travel faster than proof from one household to the next. In that silence, every sound seemed close. A step beyond a wall, a knock in the dark, or an animal moving through the snow could feel like a warning, especially when families were isolated around South Devon villages and farms. No one knew whether the marks belonged to something passing through during the night or to something still nearby. The story grew through a simple chain. Someone noticed marks. Others compared what they had seen. Reports moved through the area, and later retellings gathered separate observations into the famous claim of a trail stretching for about 100 miles. The route was associated with places including Exmouth, Topsham, and the surrounding countryside, though the surviving record does not establish one uninterrupted track. Each step could add information, but each step could also add error. A short line of marks might become a longer route in memory, and several separate trails might later seem like one continuous path. When newspaper accounts repeated the extraordinary details, distance became part of the drama, even though no complete map or measured field survey preserved the entire journey. The local observers carried a heavy burden. They had to describe a frightening scene while the snow was changing, neighbors were pressing them for answers, and familiar animal tracks failed to match what lay before them. Some marks were reported near houses, gardens, lanes, and walls, but the original observers did not have standardized forms, photographs, or instruments for recording each impression. In the first telling, uncertainty was not a small detail. It was the central fact. These were ordinary people trying to report an unusual sight before weather, darkness, and repeated questioning altered what they remembered. A footprint seen at dawn could look different by afternoon, after thawing, trampling, drifting snow, or the passing of curious neighbors. To judge the case fairly, several kinds of evidence must be separated. There is the reported date in February 1855, the South Devon location, the shape of the marks, the claimed route, the barriers the trail was said to cross, and the written or reported accounts that preserved the story. These categories do not carry equal weight, and each answers a different historical question. None of these details should be treated as proof simply because it was repeated. Each one must be tested on its own, then compared with the others. A report can show that a story existed without proving that every part of the story happened exactly as later versions claimed. Even a contemporary newspaper account may preserve rumor, compression, or a witness statement altered during transmission. But behind those records was a private moment. Someone stood outside a house, looked down at a line of shapes pressed into fresh snow, and tried to judge danger from almost nothing. The observer may have had only lamplight, a doorway, and a few seconds of attention before returning indoors, yet that brief impression became part of a much larger public mystery. The mystery began there, not in a book or a newspaper, but with a human being facing a scene that did not make sense. The marks offered no clear body, no known owner, and no safe way to tell whether the danger had already passed. In a rural landscape where foxes, dogs, cats, birds, and livestock were common, the absence of an obvious animal made the impressions seem more significant. People can honestly report something strange and still misunderstand what caused it. Sincerity means a witness is telling what they believe they saw. Accuracy asks whether the event was seen clearly, remembered correctly, and described without later changes. The distinction matters because the first observations were filtered through darkness, snowfall, excitement, local rumor, and the expectations created by earlier reports. Those are different questions. Respecting frightened witnesses does not mean accepting every conclusion they reached, and doubt does not mean calling them foolish. It means examining what they saw without adding certainty that the evidence cannot bear. A careful historian can accept that people found real marks in snow while remaining uncertain about the creature, route, number, and exact shape involved. The central physical problem was simple to state and difficult to solve. The marks looked hoof-like, yet the reported trail did not behave like a normal animal trail. Descriptions often emphasized small, rounded impressions arranged in a line, sometimes compared with cloven hooves or horseshoes, but the reports varied in size, spacing, and detail. How could a real animal leave repeated marks while crossing roofs, walls, and fences without a clear change in its path? If the trail truly continued across those barriers, the animal would need to move in ways that ordinary tracks should have revealed. A roof might show snow disturbed by weight, while a wall or fence should interrupt the stride, alter spacing, or leave traces at the point of ascent and descent. That shape invited fear because it was almost familiar. A paw might suggest a fox or a dog, but a strange repeated mark with no trusted animal attached to it could feel like a signature left by an unseen visitor. The apparent regularity made the impressions seem deliberate, while the lack of claws, fur, droppings, or a visible body removed the ordinary clues that might have identified an animal. In South Devon, during February 1855, that feeling grew from small details: a mark outside a home, a line across fresh snow, and the memory of neighbors trying to understand what had passed during the night. The shape did not prove a devil, but it gave the fear a form. Once the marks were linked to the traditional image of a hoofed supernatural visitor, every unusual detail gained a darker interpretation. Snow could preserve a clear mark, which made it useful evidence. Yet the same snow could hide the ground beneath it, soften the edges of each impression, and erase the small details that connected one mark to the next. Wind could fill depressions, thawing could widen them, and later footsteps could merge separate impressions, leaving investigators with a surface record but little secure information about the original movement. That is the cruel weakness of the case. The snow made the footprints visible enough to inspire a story, but it may also have made their true path harder to judge. What survived was not a controlled experiment or a preserved cast, but a set of observations made under winter conditions, copied into reports, and interpreted through the beliefs of Victorian England. One of the first natural guesses was an escaped kangaroo. In February 1855, a traveling animal show, a private owner, or a visiting menagerie might have lost an unfamiliar animal during the confusion of winter roads, snow-covered lanes, and open fields. Devon was connected by roads and coastal traffic, so the idea was unusual, but not completely beyond the imagination of people searching for a physical explanation. For a frightened village, that idea brought a brief kind of relief. A kangaroo would be strange and potentially dangerous, but it would still be alive, flesh and bone, and governed by the rules of nature. Yet the relief faded when residents compared the theory with reports made after the snow fell on the night of February 8th and into the morning of February 9th, 1855. The kangaroo theory had to explain marks described as small hoof-like impressions, a trail said to extend for more than 100 miles, and signs reported in separate locations across rooftops, gardens, walls, and fences. Some accounts even claimed that the marks appeared to continue through narrow gaps or across obstacles that should have interrupted an ordinary animal's route. That did not make the animal theory impossible by itself. A kangaroo could have produced an unfamiliar impression, and stories could have exaggerated distances as they spread from one village to another. But one escaped kangaroo could not comfortably explain every part of the report. The more places the trail was said to reach, the more separate questions the theory had to carry. Fear creates a strong hunger for a neat answer. Once people believe something has entered their homes, naming the cause can make the panic feel smaller, even when the name is only a guess. In 1855, the label mattered because it transformed scattered impressions in snow into a single story with a beginning, a maker, and an implied limit. A kangaroo, a devil, or any other named cause could stop the conversation for a moment. But an honest witness might still stand over the marks, comparing one impression with the next, knowing that the answer placed on them did not explain what had actually been seen. The name could identify a suspected culprit without proving its presence, route, or physical ability. This was the key problem. Finding a possible maker of a mark is not the same as explaining how that maker moved. A footprint is evidence of contact between something and the ground, but a long trail also contains evidence about direction, spacing, weight, balance, and obstacles. Those details determine whether a proposed explanation can survive close examination. An animal might create a hoof-like impression in soft snow. Investigators still had to ask how it crossed fences, roofs, lanes, and other barriers, and why the reported trail seemed to continue where an ordinary line of tracks should have stopped. They also had to consider whether later reports described the same trail accurately, or whether different marks had been combined into one expanding account. In Devon, the unexplained event placed neighbors under a new kind of pressure. People were not only studying marks in the snow, they were deciding whom or what they could trust. The person who first reported a track, the neighbor who repeated it, the newspaper that printed it, or their own memory after several days of snow, conversation, and uncertainty. A prankster suggested human deceit, perhaps created with a device, a tool, or carefully arranged footprints. A strange beast suggested danger from the natural world, with a living animal loose near homes and farms. A supernatural force suggested a threat that could not be trapped, chased away, or understood by ordinary means. Each possibility changed the meaning of the same marks. The historical discussion soon widened beyond the kangaroo. Other proposed causes included an atmospheric event and an early balloon experiment. These suggestions reflected the technological and scientific imagination of the Victorian period, when balloons, telegraphy, railways, and electrical demonstrations were changing ideas about what could move through the world and what ordinary observers might fail to recognize. These ideas were attempts to keep the mystery inside the natural world. They were not proof that any one theory had won. They were working guesses, formed because the alternative was to accept a trail with no known maker. Their value lay in the questions they raised. What could travel across the landscape? What could leave marks? And what evidence would distinguish one mechanism from another? A balloon experiment could be imagined as part of the story because early balloons were still unfamiliar and could drift unpredictably over a winter landscape. A tether, basket, loose equipment, or unusual landing might have seemed capable of producing an extraordinary report. But the idea left a basic problem untouched. How would a balloon produce repeated hoof-shaped marks on the ground, one impression after another? That question was not a joke, and it was not a small detail. Any serious explanation had to connect the thing moving above the land with the marks found below it, step after step. It needed a mechanism, not merely an association with something strange in the sky. Without that connection, the balloon theory explained unfamiliarity, but not the physical evidence attributed to the trail. An atmospheric anomaly offered another possibility. Perhaps unusual wind, ice, drifting snow, or some other event had altered the surface without a normal walker passing through it. Snow can crust, soften, collapse, and collect around existing depressions, changing the appearance of marks after they are made. Weather, therefore, mattered, especially when observations were made hours after the snowfall rather than at the moment of formation. But air alone would still have to account for the repeated shape of the impressions, their reported spacing, and their movement across separate parts of the landscape. A strange wind could redistribute snow or blur a footprint. It did not automatically create a consistent sequence that residents interpreted as a track. The proposed anomaly needed to explain both the pattern and the route, not just the confusion. The Victorian investigator faced an almost impossible request. Residents wanted certainty, but the evidence was scattered, recorded at different times, and already changing as snow softened, melted, froze again, and was crossed by later footsteps. Reports could preserve observations, yet each retelling might add distance, remove uncertainty, or merge separate locations. By the time anyone compared the accounts, the original evidence was partly gone. The task was to protect reason without treating fear as foolishness. People who believed their homes had been reached by something unknown were not asking for a lecture on doubt. They were asking whether the marks outside their doors meant that the danger was still there. The answer depended on separating what had been directly observed from what had been inferred, repeated, or added afterward. A careful investigation would begin with simple questions, not a grand theory. Investigators could compare marks reported at Topsham, Limpstone, Exmouth, and nearby villages, checking whether their length, spacing, direction, and shape stayed consistent. They would record the depth of each impression, the condition of the snow, and the exact places where the trail narrowed, widened, stopped, or changed. They could also ask how the path crossed fences, walls, streams, gardens, and other barriers. A reliable survey would distinguish a person who personally inspected an impression from someone repeating a neighbor's account days later. It would also separate observations printed in newspapers from details added by editors, correspondents, or storytellers after the reports had traveled beyond Devon. That kind of caution was not coldness. In Devon during February 1855, saying that the cause was unknown meant standing between frightened neighbors and a terrifying tale that spread through villages after heavy snow. Reports later reached London newspapers, but distance weakened verification. No natural explanation had yet earned enough direct evidence to command trust, and no supernatural explanation had earned it either. Reason could feel like courage when fear filled every house. The people wanted a name for the marks, especially after hearing that they continued across places thought difficult to cross. Yet an investigator had to accept the harder truth. Doubt was honest, and honesty offered no quick shelter from the dark, no culprit to pursue, and no demonstration that could settle every rumor. The first reports mattered because they were closest to the event. They could preserve the date, the place, the weather, and the reported form of the marks before later retellings added new details. The snowfall occurred during the night of 8th February 1855, and contemporary accounts from Devon could, in principle, establish which observations were made that morning and which appeared only afterward. But an early account was not automatically perfect. A writer might record what a witness saw while also carrying the witness's fear, the vocabulary of local rumor, and the pressure to make a confusing event sound complete. A newspaper correspondent working without instruments might describe impressions as hoof-like, cloven, or made by a single creature without measuring them or preserving their exact proportions. A frightening night can harden in memory. A short break in the trail may later become a wall, a roof, or a path that never broke at all, Snow could melt unevenly, conceal shallow impressions, or erase sections exposed to wind and traffic. By the time an account was copied into another publication, uncertainty about one missing section could already have disappeared from the wording. That does not mean someone lied. Fear gives a story sharp edges, and each retelling can make those edges seem more certain than the first observation ever was. A villager describing marks as mysterious might be reporting an honest impression, while a later writer transformed that uncertainty into the stronger claim that no animal, person, or ordinary mechanism could have produced them. The claim of one continuous trail creates the central evidence problem. If observers checked every section without interruption, continuity would be powerful evidence that one cause made the marks. It would connect impressions across multiple settlements and reduce the chance that unrelated tracks had been combined. But the surviving record does not provide a complete, measured field survey of every reported section. Separate sightings could also have been joined later into a single route. A mark seen in one village and another mark seen farther away might belong to the same trail, or they might only have been connected by the story people built around them. Differences in date, distance, witness, and source become crucial because a continuous route cannot be demonstrated simply by placing separate newspaper reports beside one another. The missing links were lonely places in the account. Someone could follow impressions until they vanished at an obstacle, then find similar marks beyond it, with nothing in between but untouched snow. That pattern might indicate melting, drifting, poor visibility, or a mistaken connection. It might also preserve a genuine unexplained gap. Without contemporaneous measurements, maps, or preserved samples, the gap remains evidence of uncertainty rather than proof of disappearance. That empty space could feel more frightening than the mark itself. A footprint was evidence of contact with the ground, but a gap invited the mind to imagine the unseen body that had crossed it. The question became mechanical as well as supernatural. How far apart were the impressions, how deep were they, and what force could have carried a maker over ground where no matching contact was recorded? Reports of marks on rooftops created a separate problem. A roof changed the height, the surface, and the way a person or animal could reach it. Snow on a sloping roof would behave differently from snow in a lane, and an impression viewed from the ground could be difficult to identify. The report, therefore, required more than the phrase rooftop footprints. It required a precise location and a direct inspection. Investigators would need to know whether the marks were truly on the roof, how they had been observed, and whether anyone had climbed up to inspect them. They would also need to ask whether snow had fallen from a higher surface, whether tracks near an eave had been mislocated, or whether a later retelling had enlarged marks beside a roof into marks across it. Each possibility changes the evidential weight without accusing the original witness of invention. For a family inside a small home, a wall was more than stone, brick, or wood. On a dark winter night, it was the promise that the outside world could not simply enter. The distinction mattered because a mark beside a wall, on a path around a house, or on a roof edge carried a different meaning from an impression demonstrably placed on both sides of solid masonry. That is why the idea of marks passing through walls struck such deep fear. It seemed to remove the one barrier people trusted, turning home from a place of safety into a place that could be reached by something with no known body. In 1855, when homes were lit by candles, oil lamps, or dim fires, an unexplained trail near the threshold could become a threat to the entire household. The phrase "through walls" must therefore be handled with care. It might mean marks found on both sides of a wall, marks close to a wall, or a story that sounded as if the trail had passed through solid material. It might also reflect a report compressed during transmission from witness to local correspondent to newspaper reader. Those meanings cannot be treated as interchangeable evidence. The record can preserve that people made the claim without proving exactly what they meant. In the history of the devil's footprints, the mystery survives partly because the reports are detailed enough to disturb us, yet uncertain enough to resist a final answer. The strongest conclusion is narrower. Unusual marks were reported after the February 1855 snowfall, but the surviving evidence cannot establish one maker, one uninterrupted trail, or a passage through solid walls. In Devon, England, in February 1855, reports began to gather around high fences and garden walls. The marks seemed to stop at places built by human hands, while the snow on the other side appeared to hold the trail again. For families already shut in by winter, every fence became more than a fence. It became a line that something may have crossed while no one was watching. That feeling changed the shape of the fear. People were not simply tracking an animal through open fields. They believed that something had moved past the borders of homes, yards, and roads, leaving no safe answer behind. A locked door could protect a family from a person, but it could not explain marks that seemed to continue beyond a barrier. Each fence report needed to be checked with care. Was the snow truly untouched on both sides? Was there a gate nearby, or a low place where an animal could pass? Did the marks on either side have the same size, shape, and spacing, or did later retellings make them seem connected? The ground around the claim mattered as much as the marks themselves. A trail crossing a fence is strong evidence only when the snow, the fence, and the nearby paths are all known. Without that wider record, a strange detail may be real, while the larger story remains uncertain. That is why unexplained evidence can survive for generations. A mark in the snow is something solid, but the cause may be missing. An incomplete answer can hold the mind more tightly than a false answer, because the open space keeps inviting one more explanation. The story remained alive because it offered no trusted way to close the door. If the marks were made by an animal, which animal had moved so far? If they came from weather, why did people describe repeated shapes? Each gap gave fear room to grow. The claim of a trail stretching for about 100 miles carries an even heavier burden, a route that long would cross fields, lanes, villages, fences, roofs, and many kinds of snow. It would also pass through many communities, each with its own witness, memory, and way of describing what had happened. The key question is whether anyone directly checked that entire route. The surviving reports do not show a single investigator following one unbroken line from end to end. Instead, the account appears to have grown from separate observations gathered across a wide area. That does not make every report false, but it makes the idea of one continuous trail much harder to prove. Distance turned one household's fear into a shared fear. A family might tell itself that the strange marks belong to one nearby field or to one neighbor's story. But if similar reports came from far away, the danger no longer seemed local. On 9th February 1855, reports from Devon were already moving beyond the places where the marks had first been noticed. The farther the story traveled, the harder it became for residents to believe that the trouble belonged only to one dark corner of their own village. Yet a wide area also created confusion. Snow does not behave the same way everywhere. Wind can smooth one road while leaving another untouched. Roofs, fences, mud, footprints, and human traffic can change the ground from one place to the next. Two reports may use the same words and still describe different events. One witness may have seen clear marks in fresh snow. Another may have seen broken shapes after wind and people had crossed the area. Similar stories do not automatically prove a single cause. For the person who doubted the devil, the cost could be personal. Telling frightened neighbors that the marks might have a simple cause could sound cruel, as if their fear did not matter. Skepticism could feel like an attack on the community itself. That pressure made careful doubt difficult. A cautious observer had to separate respect for the witnesses from belief in the explanation. The people may have seen something strange and still have misunderstood what the strange thing was. Natural explanations are useful only when they make clear predictions. A kangaroo, one suggested idea, should leave signs of animal movement, with a body and stride that fit its tracks. A balloon could explain movement through the air, but it would not easily explain repeated hoof-like marks across the ground. An event caused by the atmosphere would also have to match the physical evidence. It would need to explain the shape, spacing, direction, and condition of the marks, not just the fact that the night had been cold or windy. A theory earns trust by fitting the details that can be tested. There was danger on both sides of the mystery. Believers could rush toward the devil because fear demanded a name. Skeptics could rush toward a weak natural answer simply because uncertainty was uncomfortable. The harder position was also the most honest. The reports were disturbing, the witnesses may have been sincere, and the surviving evidence was incomplete. The record allowed a real historical mystery, but it did not yet provide a proven cause. The historical record can establish that people in Devon discussed strange footprints after snowfall in February 1855. Contemporary reports described marks found across parts of the county, and newspapers helped circulate the account beyond the original witnesses. That evidence proves a report existed, was copied, and attracted attention. It does not prove a supernatural being, one uninterrupted trail, or every detail later attached to it. This difference matters because evidence that a story was reported is not the same as evidence that its cause was understood. A newspaper could preserve the date, location, and appearance of marks while leaving their maker unidentified. The records show what correspondents and witnesses claimed to have seen. They cannot by themselves establish what physically produced the impressions in the snow. Imagine the person who first put the event into words. They were describing marks that had appeared overnight, probably after darkness limited observation and snowfall concealed older tracks. They had to report unusual details while knowing that neighbors might question the shape, distance, or continuity of what they remembered. Even an honest account could contain uncertainty created by weather, darkness, and hurried inspection. Writing the account carried a quiet risk in a 19th century community. If the story sounded too strange, the writer could seem foolish, credulous, or eager for attention. If the wording stayed careful and plain, the fear and confusion behind the discovery might disappear. A surviving report therefore contains two things at once: information about the marks and evidence of how difficult it was to describe them without inviting embarrassment. The first layer was the physical surface, impressions in snow, reportedly resembling small hooves or paired marks. The second layer was a local account describing where those impressions had been found and how far they seemed to continue. The third was a wider story, carried between villages, copied by correspondents, and printed in newspapers. Each layer increased the audience while distancing later readers from the original evidence. After that came the name Devil's Footprints, a phrase that gave the mystery a memorable identity. Later retellings added claims about movement across rooftops, walls, fences, and enclosed spaces. Some accounts emphasized a trail extending for nearly 100 miles, while others compressed scattered reports into a single route. Each layer may have added meaning, and history becomes hardest to separate from legend where those layers meet. Still, the case against a simple animal is not empty. The most difficult details remain the hoof-like form of the impressions, the reported scale of the trail, and claims that marks appeared in places an ordinary animal should not have crossed. Roofs, narrow passages, walled enclosures, and high fences became especially important because they transformed a strange track into a claimed problem of access. Taken together, those details create a problem that no simple animal explanation fully settles. An animal could plausibly leave prints in fresh snow, especially near fields, lanes, or gardens. It becomes harder to explain a reported sequence that crosses barriers or links distant locations. That difficulty does not make the supernatural answer proven. It means only that the most striking reports resist an easy, single-cause explanation. The animal theory struggles most with barriers and distance. A fox, dog, badger, or other creature might account for isolated marks on open ground, but it would need a physically credible route through every reported location. It would also need to produce impressions that witnesses interpreted as similar over a wide area. Without a mapped, continuous trail and verified measurements, the theory remains possible but unconfirmed. Air-based theories face the opposite problem. Wind, drifting snow, melting, or a rare atmospheric effect could alter the surface and create misleading patterns. Yet those processes do not easily explain repeated hoof-like marks with similar spacing across separate sites. They also do not automatically account for reports of tracks on roofs, behind walls, or beyond fences. A weather explanation must match both the marks and their reported distribution. The supernatural theory gives the fear a name, but it gives investigators no testable mechanism. It cannot show how a physical impression was produced, predict where the next marks should appear, or distinguish genuine observations from later embellishment. It also cannot be checked against snow depth, weather conditions, animal tracks, building layouts, or contemporary measurements. As an interpretation, it explains the legend's mood more readily than the evidence. That was the moment certainty began to break. Every answer explained one part and abandoned another. An animal explained ordinary tracks but struggled with barriers. Wind and snow explained distortion but struggled with repeated shapes. A supernatural visitor explained the story's emotional force but supplied no mechanism. The marks seemed real enough to disturb people, yet the event refused to become a clean account with a clear beginning, body, and ending. For an investigator, that is the deepest frustration. The problem is not simply that the answer is unknown, it is that each possible answer leaves behind a different fact, demanding attention. The investigator must ask whether the marks were inspected immediately, whether witnesses compared locations, whether distances were measured or estimated, and whether later newspaper versions preserved the earliest details or altered them through repetition. A strong explanation must fit all the major facts at once. It must deal with the February 1855 date, the places named in the reports, the shape and spacing of the impressions, the reported distance, and the question of whether one trail actually connected them. It must also account for continuity. Were the marks physically followed from point to point, or were separate discoveries later joined into a single narrative? It must do this without adding claims that the evidence does not support. Explaining one impressive detail is not enough if the explanation ignores weather, terrain, buildings, or the possibility of newspaper compression. A complete answer must survive the full record, not just the most dramatic sentence. It must distinguish contemporary testimony from later folklore and verified observation from details that appeared only after the story had spread. The name Devil's Footprints survived because it carried the emotional shape of the event. It suggested that something had crossed a human limit, moving through a landscape people believed they understood: snow-covered lanes, fields, gardens, roofs, and village boundaries. The phrase was short enough for newspapers, memorable enough for retelling, and powerful enough to turn uncertain marks into a recognizable mystery. But the name is not proof of the devil. It is evidence of interpretation, showing how people gave meaning to fear when the facts seemed too strange, scattered, or incomplete to stand alone. A label can preserve the public reaction while concealing uncertainty about the original observations. The phrase tells us how the story was understood, not necessarily what crossed the snow in 1855. Calling the story a legend does not mean every report was invented. A legend can grow from real marks, confused observations, missing measurements, damaged snow, and years of retelling. The historical evidence may securely establish that unusual footprints were reported in Devon during February 1855, while leaving their cause unresolved. That narrower conclusion is less dramatic, but it is the one the surviving record can support. After the first shock faded, the people of Devon were left with something harder than fear: an honest unknown. The snow had shown marks that appeared to cross roads, fields, gardens, and other obstacles, yet it did not identify who or what had made them. The event supplied a pattern, but no confirmed maker, motive, or reliable explanation. Most people know this feeling in a smaller way. It is the unanswered sound in a house, the missing object that never turns up, or the memory that cannot be checked against another person's account. The lesson is not that every mystery hides a miracle. It is that refusing to fake certainty respects both the evidence and the people who first confronted it. The evidence in this case can be placed on a simple ladder. At the top are details connected to early records and identifiable locations, including reports from South Devon after the snowfall of February 1855. Those reports describe marks commonly characterized as hoof-like, and they establish that unusual tracks entered the historical record. They do not, by themselves, settle their cause. Lower down are claims repeated in later accounts without a clear record of someone checking each location at the time. At the bottom are conclusions about a supernatural maker, especially the devil named in the popular title. Those conclusions may explain the story's atmosphere and lasting appeal, but they do not prove who made the marks or whether every reported print belonged to one trail. The original residents never received a clean ending. They could watch the snow soften and disappear, hear one theory after another, and return to work, yet none of that erased the memory of finding marks where no obvious walker seemed able to go. The absence of an answer became part of the event itself, passed through local conversation and later retellings. Life continued because it had to. Fires needed tending, food needed carrying, animals needed feeding, and roads still had to be crossed despite the weather. But ordinary work now took place beside an incident that had not been solved. A person might reject the most alarming explanation and still pause before following the reported trail beyond a familiar gate or lane. The physical evidence was temporary from the beginning. Snow changes under sunlight, wind, rain, footsteps, and rising temperatures, so the shape, depth, and spacing of marks can shift before anyone makes a careful record. A print that looked distinct at dawn could soften by afternoon, while later crossings could merge separate impressions or erase their edges completely. There was no modern photograph, sealed sample, or measured cast to preserve the scene. Later investigators depended on written accounts, sketches, memories, and retellings, each of which could omit distances, confuse locations, or add a detail that sounded plausible after the original observation had vanished. Without a preserved trackway, comparison was limited from the start. That was the cruel timing of the evidence. The strange marks appeared clearly enough to frighten people, yet not permanently enough to settle the matter. Snow provided a temporary record across the Devon landscape, but the same material that revealed the impressions also destroyed them. By the time questions were organized, the physical trail had already changed or disappeared. For a witness, the snow may have offered a few hours of certainty. There were marks in front of the observer, and they seemed to form a route. For history, the same event offered generations of doubt. The people who saw the ground directly possessed information later readers could never recover, while later readers inherited only fragments of its shape and sequence. Modern readers must also resist adding details that the record does not support. That means no invented names, no exact witness words unless they are documented, no extra dates, and no modern creature stories fitted backward onto the 1855 reports. A later explanation may be interesting, but it cannot become historical evidence merely because it makes the old mystery feel complete. The supported frame is narrower but stronger. February 1855, Devon, reported hoof-like marks, a claimed trail of about 100 miles, and explanations that remain incomplete. These points can be stated without pretending that every section of the route was inspected under the same conditions. Anything beyond that must be marked as guesswork, not quietly treated as fact. There is another gap that cannot be ignored. The surviving material available for this account does not identify every original report or preserve every observation made along the claimed route. It may tell us that unusual footprints were reported, but it does not provide a complete field survey, a standardized measurement system, or a continuous chain of witnesses from one location to the next. That leaves an open question about the famous story itself. How much comes from direct records, and how much comes from later summaries that joined separate reports into one dramatic trail? A report from one village could be remembered beside a report from another, gradually producing the impression of a single uninterrupted journey. The source gap should remain visible rather than hidden behind confident retelling. The careful conclusion is limited but real. Historical evidence shows that unusual footprints were reported in South Devon in 1855, following snowfall in February. The reports were significant enough to circulate beyond the immediate witnesses and to survive in later discussions. That establishes a historical episode involving strange tracks, even if the surviving record cannot reconstruct every mark, location, or observer. That evidence does not establish that the devil made them. It does not prove that a single creature created every mark, and it does not securely verify a continuous trail measuring 100 miles. It also cannot demonstrate that the impressions all had one cause. The evidence supports reports of unusual footprints. It does not support a confirmed supernatural conclusion. Uncertainty about the cause does not make the residents' fear fake. People still had to walk past the marks, protect their homes, manage animals, and live through the social shock of seeing the ordinary landscape behave in an unfamiliar way. Fear could arise from the situation itself before anyone had decided whether the tracks came from an animal, a person, weather, or something else. In the ordinary course of life, fear does not wait for proof to arrive. A person can doubt the story and still avoid the dark road. A family can reject a supernatural claim and still remember the morning when the snow seemed to carry a warning. The historical record leaves the maker uncertain, but it preserves the human fact that, in February 1855, uncertainty itself was enough to change how Devon's people moved through their world. The case became a conflict between two kinds of trust. Residents trusted what their eyes had seen and what their memories held, strange, hoof-like marks appearing across the snow on the morning of February 8, 1855. Reports spread through South Devon, from lanes and gardens to fields and village roads, turning an ordinary winter morning into a local emergency. Investigators needed more than a frightening report. They needed a cause that matched every detail, including the shape of the marks, their spacing, their direction, and the claim that they stretched for nearly 100 miles. Neither side could fully defeat the other, because footprints were reported by multiple communities, but the complete route was never securely mapped or independently verified from end to end. The first witness faced a cold physical fact on the ground. A later storyteller inherited a dramatic tale shaped by retelling, added detail, and the pull of a good mystery. A mark noticed beside a house or garden gate was one kind of evidence. A continuous supernatural trail crossing the whole county was a much larger claim. That difference matters. The person who saw a mark did not need a legend to feel afraid. The mark itself had entered an ordinary morning alongside household chores and winter travel. But every later detail cannot be treated as equally strong when the original records are incomplete. A newspaper account written days later is not the same as a measurement made at the scene. What would have solved the mystery was simple in principle, even if difficult in practice. Historians would need a preserved set of marks, a checked route from place to place, clear records showing each fence, wall, gate, roof, riverbank, or other barrier, and a direct observation of whatever made them. They would also need dates, distances, sketches, and independent witnesses recorded before the story expanded. Those pieces are missing or uncertain. The surviving accounts do not preserve one complete chain of evidence from the first reported marks to the most distant locations. Their absence does not prove that nothing unusual happened. It explains why the case remains open and why no final answer can honestly stand on the famous story alone, especially when later summaries often sound more certain than the earliest reports. In Devon, the strange event entered homes, paths, fences, fields, and daily work. People still had animals to tend, roads to cross, fires to manage, and chores to finish. But familiar ground no longer felt fully familiar. Snow made every disturbance conspicuous, and each new report raised the question of whether the marks had come from one source or many. A few repeated shapes were enough to disturb that routine. The mystery mattered because it reached ordinary lives in South Devon, not because it took place in a distant castle or an invented world. The reported locations were practical places where residents knew the boundaries, tracks, and obstacles. That local knowledge gave the accounts their force, even when it could not settle their cause. The Victorian setting makes the tension sharper. This was a culture moving toward careful measurement, better records, and new confidence in science. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species would appear in 1859, only 4 years later, while railways, newspapers, postal networks, and scientific societies were accelerating the movement of information across Britain. Yet fear had not disappeared. The marks arrived at the point where people were learning to ask for proof while still carrying a deep fear of the unknown. A report could travel from a village witness to a newspaper office, then across the country, before anyone had inspected every location. Modern standards of evidence existed, but they were not applied consistently. Modern life often demands an instant label for every strange event. A strange sound becomes a machine, an animal, or a hoax before the evidence has been checked. Digital recordings and rapid sharing can create the same pressure today, replacing a missing observation with confident speculation and allowing a dramatic explanation to outrun the facts that first made the event puzzling. The 1855 case offers a harder lesson. A fast answer can be less honest than a slow admission that the evidence is incomplete, especially when the missing steps are the very steps needed to test the claim. Without a verified trail, a controlled comparison of footprints, or a confirmed maker, certainty becomes a conclusion imposed on the record rather than something demonstrated by it. The devil belongs in this story as a historical interpretation used by frightened residents, not as a proven cause. That distinction allows the fear to remain real without turning belief into evidence. In a 19th century Christian culture, the name carried immediate meaning, but the emotional power of that explanation cannot establish whether an animal, person, weather event, or mistake produced the marks. The name also shows how people tried to make sense of danger. When the marks had no visible maker, calling them the devil gave the threat a shape, even though it did not explain how the marks had appeared. It answered the question of identity without answering the physical questions of movement, pressure, spacing, direction, and the reported ability to cross obstacles. Human beings often name what they cannot see. Saying the devil may have helped neighbors share their fear, compare what they had noticed, and feel less alone. A common label could connect separate reports from farms, lanes, and settlements, giving scattered observations a single meaning before anyone had established whether they truly belonged to one event. But the name also made the mystery larger and darker. Once fear was tied to faith, it became harder to separate the physical evidence from the story built around it. A footprint could be measured, copied, or compared with animal tracks. A demonic explanation added moral and supernatural significance that could not be tested by examining snow, fences, or the surviving newspaper testimony. Each proposed cause solves one part of the case and strains against another. A kangaroo offers a body that could leave hoof-like marks, and exotic animals were occasionally kept in Britain, but it struggles to explain the reported route, the full spread of the trail, and claims that the marks appeared across separated properties. It also lacks a documented animal linked to the event. A balloon offers movement through the air, but it struggles with marks that appeared to belong to hooves and with repeated impressions on the ground. The atmosphere offers mystery and strange conditions, but it does not provide a clear maker, verified mechanism, or preserved physical trace. The strongest historical conclusion is narrower. Unusual footprints were reported in Devon in 1855, while their cause remains unproven. The deepest frustration lies in how close each theory comes to fitting. A kangaroo could explain a body moving through snow, a balloon could explain a path that crossed barriers, and a natural event could explain strange marks, but none of them explains the whole record. Each answer offers relief for a moment, then leaves one frightening detail untouched. That failure became the lasting consequence of the case. Because no single cause could be proved, the footprints moved from local report to public legend carried by newspapers and later retellings. The printed story outlived the snow itself. Once the reports reached a wider audience, the event no longer belonged only to the people who saw the marks. It became part of Britain's shared store of strange historical tales. For the people near Devon, the result was less romantic. A night of uncertainty became a story others could reshape, while the original witnesses were left with memories that could not be checked against the vanished trail. The practical human cost was small compared with the disaster, but it was still real. Residents had spent hours following marks through streets, fields, gardens, walls, and rooftops, only to lose the answer when weather and time erased the evidence. The larger aftershock came from a changed assumption about what a newspaper could preserve. A report printed in 1855 could save the outline of an event while losing the details needed to test it. The case shows why the source matters as much as the story. A newspaper can record that people saw footprints, but it cannot turn every witness into a trained observer, recover the snow after it melts, or prove that every mark belonged to one continuous trail. One important record was the report published in the Illustrated London News in March 1855. It helped preserve the mystery, but it also gave later readers a polished account built from information that had already passed through witnesses, local discussion, and editorial selection. The unresolved question is simple to state and impossible to answer with confidence. What made the first mark, and did the same cause truly make every mark that followed? That question remains open because the trail was never secured as evidence. No cast was taken, no photograph fixed the shapes, and no measured survey preserved the full route before the snow changed. The durable consequence is cultural rather than scientific. The Devil's Footprints became a case study in how an incomplete record can gain a life of its own, especially when fear gives the event a memorable name. That name also changed the burden placed on the people connected to it. Instead of being remembered as residents reporting unusual tracks, they became part of a legend that seemed to demand a monster, a miracle, or a perfect explanation. The aftershock reached beyond Devon because the story challenged a common faith in printed certainty. If a report appeared in a newspaper, many readers treated its strange details as settled fact even when the original evidence had already disappeared. In 1855, that habit was strengthened by distance. People reading in London or elsewhere could not inspect the snow in Devon, question every witness, or compare each footprint for themselves, so the printed account became the closest thing they had to the scene. The record still cannot settle whether the reports described one connected event or several ordinary tracks joined together by retelling. That distinction matters because a single trail suggests one hidden cause, while separate observations could have been woven into a pattern after the fact. It also cannot tell us how much the footprints changed before investigators arrived. Snow can soften edges, hide gaps, and make different marks appear alike, leaving later readers to judge a trail that no longer existed in its original form. The long-term lesson is found in the missing measurements. Modern investigators would want exact locations, distances, track sizes, depth, weather data, and marks from several angles, but none of that was collected in a form that can now be checked. So the 1855 Devil's Footprints remain historical evidence, but not proof of a devil. They show that people reported something unusual, that the report was preserved, and that the central physical question was lost before anyone could test it properly.